Hey everyone. Tonight we're stepping into one of the most extraordinary social contrasts in modern history. The Great Depression, which lasted roughly from the stock market crash of October 1929 through to the early 1940s, and which produced the most dramatic inequality in living standards that the United States had seen since the Gilded Age. We know the Depression from its hardest images: the breadlines, the Hoovervilles, the Dust Bowl migrants, the faces in Dorothea Lange's photographs. Tonight we're looking at the other side of that picture. What was life actually like for the people who stayed rich, and in some cases got richer, while a quarter of the American workforce was unemployed? The answer involves more contradiction, more complexity, and more genuine strangeness than you might expect. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand what the Depression meant for the wealthy, you first have to understand what the 1920s had been for them, because the contrast is the story. The 1920s, the decade that Scott Fitzgerald captured and partly invented as the Jazz Age, was a period of extraordinary prosperity for the American upper class, built on the expansion of industrial production, the emergence of consumer culture, the explosion of the stock market, and the particular American confidence of a country that had emerged from the First World War as the world's creditor nation, the country that everyone else owed money to, the country whose moment had arrived. The wealth of the American elite in the 1920s was concentrated with a narrowness that is difficult to exaggerate. By 1928, the top 1% of Americans received approximately 23% of all income in the United States. The top 0.1%, a few thousand families, controlled more wealth than the bottom 40% combined. This was not a secret. It was not even particularly controversial in an era when the dominant ideology was one of minimum government interference and maximum freedom for the economically successful to enjoy the fruits of their success. The melon tax cuts of the 1920s had reduced the top marginal income tax rate from 73% to 25%. Money flowed upward with a freedom that made the Gilded Age look restrained. Our three companions tonight are Cornelia, the daughter of a Pittsburgh steel fortune who is 23 years old on the day of the crash, and who will spend the 1930s navigating the particular social world of the wealthy in a decade when the rest of America is in desperate need. A world that continues with remarkable persistence and that generates in Cornelia a complicated mixture of guilt, denial, defiance, and genuine confusion about what her position in it means. There is Edward, a New York investment banker whose firm survives the crash through a combination of luck, ruthlessness, and the insider knowledge that the financial world provides. A man who understands exactly what has happened to the economy and exactly how to profit from that understanding. And there is Beatrice, a Hollywood actress of the second rank, whose studio contract means that her income continues through the worst years of the Depression, and whose social world intersects with both the very wealthy and the very creative in ways that illuminate the culture of the period from a specific and revealing angle. The crash itself, the stock market collapse of October 1929, with Black Thursday on the 24th and Black Tuesday on the 29th, is often portrayed as the moment when the wealthy lost everything overnight. The reality is more complicated. Many wealthy Americans were heavily invested in the stock market and suffered real losses in the immediate aftermath. But the stock market is not the whole economy, and the initial crash did not immediately destroy the fortunes of those whose wealth was in land, in operating businesses, in bonds, in the physical plant of industrial enterprises. The depression that followed the crash developed over 3 years of deflation and contraction and banking failure, and its effect on the wealthy was uneven in ways that the uniform misery of the poor obscures. Edward watches the crash from his office window, which overlooks Broad Street, where the crowd has gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange. He has been watching the market for weeks, has sensed the instability, has moved a significant portion of his firm's most vulnerable positions into cash before the collapse. He is not unharmed. No one is unharmed, but he is less harmed than most, and the knowledge of this sits in him with a particular quality that he will spend the next decade trying to name. It is not quite guilt. It is not quite triumph. It is something more like the feeling of a man who has stepped back from a cliff edge just in time, and who is aware, in the clarity of the moment after, that the people who went over were not in any important respect different from himself. The great houses of the American wealthy did not go dark during the Depression. This is perhaps the most fundamental fact about wealthy life in the 1930s. The Newport cottages, the Vanderbilt's breakers, the Belmont's Belcourt, continued to be maintained and staffed and used for their summer seasons, even as breadlines formed in Providence. The Fifth Avenue mansions of New York continued to host their dinners and their dances. The Long Island estates continued to receive their weekend guests. The operation of a great American house in the 1930s was in some ways easier than it had been in the 1920s, because the surplus of domestic labor drove wages down to levels that made the maintenance of large staffs cheaper than at any time since the Civil War. The domestic service economy of the 1930s is one of the more disturbing aspects of Depression-era wealthy life, and it is one that the wealthy largely failed to examine. The wages of domestic servants, cooks, maids, butlers, chauffeurs, gardeners, laundresses, fell dramatically in the early years of the Depression as the labor market flooded with desperate workers. A cook who had earned $15 a week in 1929 might find herself earning $8 by 1932, and still competing for the position with a dozen equally qualified applicants. The wealthy who employed domestic servants used this dynamic with the matter-of-fact efficiency of people for whom the labor market was simply the mechanism through which help was obtained at the lowest available price. Cornelia's family home in Pittsburgh is a 20-room house staffed by 8 domestic servants before the crash and by 10 afterward, because 2 additional women presented themselves at the back door in the winter of 1930 and offered to work for their room and board alone. Cornelia's mother hired them both. As an act of charity, she described to her friends as almost embarrassingly practical. she paid them a small wage in the end, because the room and board offer made her uncomfortable in a way she did not entirely examine. And she told herself that paying something was better than paying nothing, which was both true and insufficient as a moral position, and which her daughter Cornelia recognized as insufficient even at 23, and could not yet articulate why. The maintenance of the great country houses required not just domestic servants, but groundskeepers, stable staff, and the craftspeople who kept the physical plant functioning. These positions also became cheaper to fill in the depression, and some houses that had been cutting back on maintenance in the 1920s resumed full operation in the early 1930s. This gives the Depression-era great house a somewhat paradoxical quality. It is, in many cases, better maintained and more fully staffed in the years of national crisis than it was in the years of national prosperity. The invisible hand of the labor market, applied to the problem of domestic service, produced in the 1930s, the golden age of the American great house, financed by the misery of the people who maintained it. The house staffs of the 1930s were predominantly women for the indoor positions and men for the outdoor ones. Young women without education or marketable skills found domestic service one of the few alternatives to destitution, and the supply of domestic workers was augmented by women from the rural Midwest and South, who migrated to the cities specifically looking for household work. The relationship between the wealthy employer and the domestic worker in the Depression is a study in the particular intimacy and the particular power imbalance of people who live in the same house and participate in very different ways in the same household life. The employer deciding what the household is for, the worker deciding whether that vision can be maintained within the constraints of what the employer is willing to pay. The food of the wealthy during the Depression is another area of remarkable persistence and remarkable contrast. While millions of Americans were surviving on government relief food, dried beans, flour, cornmeal, the occasional canned good, the dining tables of the wealthy continued to be set with the full apparatus of formal service. The multi-course dinner, the correct wines, the properly executed sauces, the desserts that required the labor of a trained pastry cook. All of these continued unchanged, and in some cases improved, because the quality of food available to those with money to spend was actually better in the early Depression than it had been in the late 1920s. The reason for this improvement is the same as the improvement in domestic service: deflation.
The prices of food fell dramatically in the early years of the Depression. Farm commodity prices collapsed by 50% or more between 1929 and 1933, and the effect on the cost of a high-quality dinner was substantial. A dinner that cost a wealthy hostess $20 to produce in 1929 might cost $12 in 1932, with no reduction in quality and possibly an improvement in freshness, since more farmers were selling directly to wealthy households rather than through the commodity markets. The agricultural catastrophe that was devastating farm families across the country was, from the perspective of the wealthy consumer, a reduction in the cost of excellent food. Prohibition, which ran from 1920 to 1933, adds a specific dimension to the Depression-era food and drink story. The 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture and sale of alcohol, but it did not prohibit possession, which meant that the wealthy who had stocked their cellars before Prohibition took effect were technically legal in their continued drinking. The speakeasy culture that supplied alcohol to those without cellars served everyone from the very wealthy, who patronized elegant establishments with celebrity clientele and excellent wine lists, to the working class who drank whatever was available. The wealthy during the Depression years often drank better than they had before Prohibition, because the best bootleggers had access to genuine imported Scotch and French champagne that the poor could not afford. Edward maintains a cellar that his father started in 1918, the year before Prohibition took effect, supplemented through his connections with the more sophisticated end of the bootlegging trade throughout the 1920s. He serves good wine at his dinner parties and he discusses it knowledgeably, and he does not think about where it comes from. He has noticed, though, that his guests drink more during the Depression than they did before it. Not the guests who have lost money, who often drink less in their anxiety about expense, but the guests who have not lost money, who seem to be using the alcohol to manage something that they do not discuss directly, but that is present in the room like a noise that only some people can hear. Beatrice's relationship with food during the Depression is shaped by the specific economics of Hollywood, where the studio system provides food on set and the social world of the industry provides a constant supply of parties and dinners at which the food is always good and the drinks are always flowing. She eats well by any standard. She's also aware, because her work puts her in contact with the full range of the entertainment industry, from the studio heads at the top to the extras and the crew at the bottom, of how differently the Depression is experienced across that range. The extras are people who eat lunch on the lot because the studio food is the meal they can count on. The studio heads are people who are having their homes expanded. Beatrice occupies the middle of this range, and she watches both ends of it with the attentiveness of someone who grew up without money and arrived at comfort through luck and talent and knows that either could be revoked. The social calendar of the American wealthy did not stop during the Depression. It contracted somewhat. There were fewer balls and fewer debutante presentations at the very top of the social scale, partly from genuine financial pressure and partly from a sense that the most extravagant displays were unseemly in a moment of national crisis. But it didn't stop. The Newport summer season continued. The Palm Beach winter season continued. The country house weekends continued. The charity galas continued, with the added justification that they were now genuinely necessary, which gave the social event a moral dimension it had lacked when it was purely entertainment. The charity ball of the Depression era is one of the period's most interesting social institutions, because it manages the tension between the continuation of wealthy social life and the national emergency with a specificity that reveals how the wealthy thought about their position. The charity ball raises money for relief funds or soup kitchens, and the admission price is set high enough to constitute a genuine contribution. The attendees dress formally, eat and drink well, dance to good music, and tell themselves and each other that the evening is primarily about the cause rather than the entertainment. This is both true and insufficient as a description of what is happening, and everyone knows it and proceeds anyway. Cornelia attends 3 charity balls in the winter of 1931 and finds herself increasingly uncomfortable with the specific quality of the social performance they require. She's not uncomfortable with charity. She believes in it genuinely and gives a portion of her own income to relief funds throughout the Depression without being asked. What she is uncomfortable with is the particular combination of genuine benevolence and self-congratulation that the charity ball produces, the sense that being seen doing good is part of the good being done, that the social performance of concern is valued as much as the concern itself. She does not yet have the language for this discomfort, but she is collecting the experiences that will eventually produce it. The debutante presentation, the formal introduction of a young woman of good family to society, continues through the Depression with a persistence that critics note and defenders justify. The New York debutante season of 1931, conducted as breadlines formed in the streets outside, is documented in the social pages with the same breathless attention that it receives in more prosperous years. The debutante's gowns are described. The flowers at Sherry's are noted. The event is a statement of continuity, a claim that the social order persists, that the rituals that mark its passages continue, that the depression is a temporary interruption rather than a fundamental change. Whether this is self-deception or necessary confidence or something in between is a question that the society columnists do not ask, and that the debutantes themselves are beginning to. Edward's wife Helen manages their social calendar with the precision of a general planning a campaign, and her management of the charity dimension of their social life is one of her particular skills. She understands which charities are the right ones to be associated with, the wrong ones being either too close to political movements that Edward's professional world finds threatening, or not sufficiently prominent to justify the investment of social capital that association entails. She has organised 2 charity benefits in 1931 that have been considered successful by the measures that matter in their world. The right people attended, the right amounts were raised, the right press coverage was secured. She does not ask whether the amounts raised are adequate to the scale of the need, because this is not a question that her social world has equipped her to ask. The wealthy Americans of the Depression years continued to travel, and in some ways they travelled more than before, because the Depression made travel cheaper. The great ocean liners, the Ile-de-France, the Normandie when it launched in 1935, the Queen Mary, continued their transatlantic routes, their first-class accommodations maintained at the highest standard and now available at prices that had dropped from the peak 1920s rates. The grand hotels of Europe offered their accustomed services at deflated prices. The wealthy American tourist of the early 1930s could live in Europe at a level of luxury that was genuinely better value than anything available at home, which produced a small but notable diaspora of wealthy Americans who spent the early Depression years in Paris and Cannes and Rome, maintaining their standard of living while the dollar stretched further than it ever had. The transatlantic voyage itself, a week of enforced leisure on a floating palace, insulated from the news of the world by the specific isolation of the mid-ocean crossing, was a particular pleasure for those who could afford it. The first-class passengers on the great liners of the 1930s were served by a staff-to-passenger ratio that rivaled the best hotels, ate at tables set with the finest silver and crystal, danced in ballrooms designed by the best architects in Europe, and spent their days in a world so carefully constructed to provide comfort that the Depression was, for the duration of the crossing, simply not present. Cornelia makes the Atlantic crossing twice in the 1930s and finds the transition from the self-contained world of the ship to the reality of either New York or Southampton somewhat jarring, as if the ship has been a parenthesis in the sentence of the decade, and she has to remember each time she disembarks which sentence she's actually in. The great American resort destinations continued to function with some adjustments. Palm Beach maintained its season, though the tone was somewhat more subdued and the most conspicuous displays were less frequent. The famous Everglades Club continued its membership policy of admitting only Protestants. The anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism of the WASP elite's resort culture being one of the more persistent features of the era's social world, and continued to offer the golf and tennis and dinner dances that were the substance of the season. The prices had come down. The company was roughly the same. The country house weekend, the Friday to Monday gathering of a dozen or so guests at a wealthy person's rural estate, organised around meals and sport and conversation, was perhaps the social institution that maintained its character most completely through the Depression. The logistics were easier in the 1930s than in the 1920s. The additional servants were available.
The food was cheaper, the wine was adequate. The conversation, however, had changed. The country house weekend of the 1920s was conducted in the general confidence of people for whom the system was working. The 1930s version was conducted in the awareness that the system had spectacularly failed most of the people it was supposed to serve, and that the people in the room were exceptions rather than the norm, and that the exception required some form of justification that the 1920s had not required. The political response of the wealthy to the Depression is one of the most documented and most debated aspects of the period. It involves a genuine conflict between economic interest, political ideology, and personal morality that different wealthy individuals resolved in very different ways. Some of the most interesting figures of the Depression era are wealthy people who supported the New Deal, who used their social position and financial resources to advocate for policies that would reduce their own tax burden and regulatory freedom. Others are among the most determined opponents of Roosevelt's programs, people who saw in the New Deal a fundamental threat to the social order that had produced their wealth. The American Liberty League, founded in 1934 by a group of wealthy Democrats opposed to Roosevelt's New Deal, is perhaps the purest expression of the wealthy anti-New Deal position. Its founders included Irénée DuPont, Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors, and a group of Wall Street lawyers who believed that the New Deal's labor protections, financial regulations, and relief programs represented a dangerous departure from the American constitutional tradition. The Liberty League had money. It was the best-funded political organization in American history up to that point, and it had the social connections to operate at the highest levels of political life. What it did not have was popular support because its message, that the wealthy deserved to keep what they had and that the poor deserved what the market gave them, was difficult to sell to an electorate that had just watched the market give them the Depression. Edward is not a Liberty League member, though he knows several who are and finds their arguments both understandable and politically tin-eared. He is a pragmatist in his politics, which means he supported Hoover when Hoover seemed likely to manage the crisis effectively and shifted his support to Roosevelt when it became clear that Hoover would not. His primary political criterion throughout is not ideology but the question of which candidate is most likely to restore the conditions in which his business can operate profitably. He finds the New Deal's financial regulations genuinely irritating. The Glass-Steagall Act that separates commercial and investment banking costs his firm real money, but he recognizes that some regulatory framework is the price of preventing a recurrence of the conditions that produced the crash, and he pays that price with the equanimity of a man who understands that the alternative is worse for everyone, including himself. Cornelia's politics in the Depression are shaped by the particular combination of her family's Republican heritage and her own emerging awareness of the distance between the world she inhabits and the world outside it. Her father is a Liberty League sympathizer who regards Roosevelt as a traitor to his class. The phrase meant as an insult but that Roosevelt wore as a kind of distinction. Her mother is less interested in politics than in maintaining the social world. Cornelia herself has been reading. She has more time for reading in the 1930s than she expected, and the economics and the journalism and the novels are all pointing her toward a view of the Depression that her family's social world does not accommodate. She finds herself agreeing with people her father considers dangerous radicals, and she does not yet know what to do with this agreement. The figure of the wealthy New Dealer is one of the most interesting social types of the period. A person who uses their privileged position to advocate for structural changes that would, if fully implemented, reduce that privilege. Eleanor Roosevelt is the supreme example, a woman who came from the most patrician of backgrounds and used her social position to advocate for the poor with a directness that many of her class found mortifying. Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor, came from a modest background and arrived at the New Deal through social work. Together they represent the two routes to progressive politics that the 1930s produces: the person who chooses it from privilege and the person who arrives at it through experience. Both routes lead to the same place, and the wealthy who take the first route are always slightly suspect to those who took the second, for reasons that are not entirely unfair. The cultural life of the wealthy during the Depression is one of the period's most productive contradictions. The arts in America flourished during the Depression with a richness that the more prosperous 1920s had not always produced, and the wealthy were both consumers and patrons of this cultural production in ways that shaped the art of the period. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the the symphony orchestras and opera companies and theaters of New York and Boston and Chicago all continued their programming and in some cases expanded it, funded by the continued patronage of the wealthy who found in culture both genuine pleasure and the kind of social distinction that conspicuous consumption of goods could no longer so easily provide. The Museum of Modern Art is a particular case study in Depression-era cultural patronage. Founded by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Lily P. Bliss, and Mary Quinn Sullivan in the month of the crash, it embodies the paradox of wealthy cultural life in the Depression with almost uncomfortable completeness. Its founding collection includes works by Cézanne and Van Gogh and Seurat and Picasso, assembled through the financial resources and connoisseurship of women who were simultaneously among the wealthiest people in the country and genuinely committed to making modern art accessible to a democratic public. Abby Rockefeller's husband John D. Rockefeller Jr. opposed the project and refused to fund it, believing that modern art was decadent or socialist or both. Abby funded it from her own resources. The museum opened its doors to the public in the week of the crash and has been open ever since. Beatrice's relationship with culture during the Depression is professional as much as personal. The film industry is the great cultural institution of the Depression era. Movies are the cheapest and most accessible form of entertainment available to the population, and the studios must balance the desire to engage seriously with the world and the need to provide the escapism that audiences are paying their 15 cents for. Beatrice works in this tension every time she makes a picture, and she finds it creatively productive in a way that the pure escapism of the 1920s pictures was not. The Depression-era film has a quality of engaged seriousness, in the best work of Frank Capra and John Ford and William Wyler, that the boom-era's pictures lacked, and that quality reflects a genuine attempt to think about the world rather than simply to distract from it. The Federal Art Project and the Federal Writers Project, the New Deal programs that employed artists and writers, produced an extraordinary body of work that complicates the narrative of wealthy cultural patronage. The WPA murals that decorated post offices and courthouses across the country were funded by the government rather than by private patrons, and they depicted subject matter, workers, farmers, the ordinary people of America, that private patrons rarely commissioned. The tension between the government-supported art of the New Deal and the privately patronized art of the wealthy cultural institutions is one of the defining cultural tensions of the period, producing a moment of genuine democratic cultural vitality that the subsequent decades, with their return to private patronage and market-driven cultural production, will not quite replicate. Cornelia begins collecting art in the early 1930s, at first because it is the kind of thing that women of her background do, and then increasingly because she has developed a genuine eye and a genuine enthusiasm. She buys American painters, the regionalists Thomas Hart Benton and Grant Wood and John Stewart Curry, whose subject matter is the rural American heartland that she has never lived in but that the Depression has made her feel responsible for in some way she cannot entirely articulate. She also buys the social realists, Ben Shahn, Philip Evergood, whose work depicts the Depression directly, the breadlines and the dispossessed and the labor disputes, and she hangs these paintings in her Pittsburgh home alongside the family portraits and the landscapes that her mother selected. The combination is a kind of argument she is having with herself about who she is and what she owes. The marriage market of the American wealthy during the Depression is a subject that the social historians of the period have documented with considerable attention, because it reveals the intersection of romantic aspiration and economic reality with unusual clarity. The Depression changed the calculations of wealthy marriage in several specific ways, most of them involving the question of which fortunes had survived intact and which had not, and how this affected the desirability of potential partners in a world where the match of two substantial fortunes had been the social ideal of the previous decade. The impoverished son of a formerly wealthy family, a figure that the Depression produced in considerable numbers as businesses failed and investments were wiped out, was a social phenomenon with no precise 1920s equivalent. Young men who had been raised with every expectation of inherited wealth found themselves in their 20s without it, possessed of the education and the manners and the social connections of the wealthy but not the financial resources that gave those things their particular value in the marriage market. Some managed the transition with grace. Others did not. The Depression-era society pages are full of engagements broken off and marriages delayed, as the calculations that underlie the romantic language of social life were revised in the light of reduced balance sheets. Cornelia does not marry in the 1930s. This is a choice she makes with increasing deliberateness as the decade progresses, and that her family regards with increasing concern. The men who present themselves as potential partners are, in her assessment, either not interesting enough or too comfortable with a life that she is becoming less comfortable with, and the combination of these two insufficiencies means that she keeps finding reasons not to proceed. She is building something in the 1930s, she does not yet know what, and the building requires a freedom of movement and a freedom of attention that marriage to the kind of man her world produces would complicate. Her mother considers this a mistake. Her mother is not entirely wrong. Beatrice's romantic life during the Depression is shaped by the specific culture of Hollywood, where the public and the private are more thoroughly entangled than in any other social world in America. The studio system manages its stars' public images with a control that extends to their romantic relationships. Studios arranged marriages between stars for publicity purposes, suppressed relationships that were considered professionally damaging, and generally treated the romantic lives of their contract players as assets to be managed rather than lives to be lived. Beatrice navigates this with a pragmatism that is the product of her background. She grew up without illusions about the distinction between what people present and what they are, and she finds the studio's management of her image both irritating and, on balance, not worth fighting because the fight would cost more than the management does. The relationship between the wealthy household and its domestic staff during the Depression is one of the most intimate expressions of the era's inequality. The domestic workers of the 1930s, the cooks and the maids and the butlers and the chauffeurs and the laundresses and the governesses, lived in the houses of the wealthy, shared their physical space, participated in their daily routines, and yet occupied a social world as separate from the household's family as if they were on the other side of the city. This proximity without equality is one of the defining features of wealthy life in the Depression, and it produces in both the employing and the employed a set of psychological adaptations that the domestic advice literature of the period manages with a thoroughness that suggests both parties found it necessary. The life below stairs in a 1930s wealthy American household is documented in the memoirs and oral histories that domestic workers have left behind, and the picture that emerges is of a world governed by detailed hierarchy and specific ritual that mirrors the formality of the household above while being organized by entirely different social logic. The butler occupies the top of the below-stairs hierarchy and manages the household's male staff with the same careful attention to precedence and protocol that the household's mistress brings to her social calendar. The cook is the second most powerful person below stairs, and her authority in the kitchen is absolute. The newer maids are at the bottom of a hierarchy whose upper end they may eventually reach, if they last long enough and perform well enough, and if the household's finances continue to justify their employment. Cornelia's awareness of the below-stairs world of her family's house develops during the Depression in a way that it did not in the 1920s, when the staff were simply present and she moved among them without particular attention. In the 1930s she begins to notice, to really notice rather than simply to observe, the individual people who maintain her family's household. She notices that the cook, Mrs. Brennan, who has been with the family for 11 years, is supporting her sister's family since her brother-in-law lost his job at the mill. She notices that the newest maid, a girl of 19 from West Virginia, cries on Sunday afternoons. She begins to ask questions, carefully and with the awareness that her position makes certain questions inappropriate, and she receives careful answers that reveal more than they explicitly say. The below-stairs world, she is discovering, has been watching the above-stairs world with as much attention as she is now bringing to watching them, and it has formed views about what it sees that she would find instructive if the social distance between them permitted their full expression. The wages of domestic servants during the Depression are not a subject that the wealthy discussed openly with each other, partly from the discretion that financial matters generally received in their social world, and partly because the wages they were paying were low enough to be a source of discomfort rather than pride. The National Recovery Administration, part of Roosevelt's New Deal, attempted to establish minimum wage guidelines for domestic workers, but domestic service was exempted from the NRA codes, as it was from most subsequent labor legislation, and the wages paid to household workers remained at the discretion of the employer in a way that the wages of factory workers did not. This exemption was not accidental. It was the result of lobbying by the employers of domestic workers, which is to say by the wealthy, who understood that their comfortable way of life depended on the availability of cheap domestic labor and who used their political influence to protect that availability. Edward's household runs on a staff of 7, managed by his wife Helen with the same precision that she brings to the social calendar. Helen is not cruel to her staff. She is considerate in the specific ways that her social world defines consideration, which means that she gives generous Christmas gifts and accommodates illnesses and does not require Sunday afternoon service unless there are guests. What she does not do is think of her staff as people whose economic situation is related to her own in any direct causal way, which means that she can read in the newspaper about the condition of unemployed domestic workers in New York City and feel genuine sympathy without connecting that condition to the wages she is paying her own cook, which have not increased since 1928. This is not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. It is the particular form of moral compartmentalization that comfortable people develop to manage the distance between their values and their practices. Not all wealthy Americans maintain their wealth through the Depression. The decade produced a significant number of genuine economic catastrophes at the upper end of the social scale, people who had been genuinely wealthy in 1929 and who found themselves genuinely broke by 1933 or 1934. The stories of these financial collapses are instructive not because they produce sympathy for people who had more than enough to begin with, but because they reveal the specific mechanisms by which large fortunes disappeared during the Depression and the specific social experience of wealthy people who found themselves on the wrong side of the catastrophe. The most common route to Depression-era financial ruin for the wealthy was leverage, the use of borrowed money to amplify investment returns. The bull market of the 1920s had made leverage appear not just acceptable but sophisticated. Many wealthy investors had bought stocks on margin, borrowing 60 to 90% of the purchase price, and when the market fell, the margin calls came. The positions were sold, the loans remained, and men who had considered themselves worth millions found themselves worth nothing or less than nothing, owing money to banks that were themselves in crisis. The mechanism was clear. The speed was shocking. A man who had been worth $5 million in September 1929 could be worth negative numbers by November, not through any particular foolishness on his part but simply because the leverage that had amplified his gains amplified his losses with equal and merciless efficiency. The social experience of financial ruin among the wealthy is documented in the memoirs of the period with a specificity that reveals the particular cruelties of a world organized around money. The country club membership that lapses because the dues cannot be paid. The house that has to be sold because the mortgage cannot be met. The servants who have to be let go, both a practical necessity and a social humiliation, because the size of one's staff is one of the markers of one's position and its reduction is a public statement of one's changed circumstances. The charity gala ticket that cannot be bought. The debutante presentation that has to be canceled. These are real losses of real things, but they exist in a different order of magnitude from the losses of the poor, who are not losing a country club membership but the ability to feed their children. The psychological experience of financial ruin among those who had been wealthy is documented in some detail. The suicides of wealthy men in the immediate aftermath of the crash, dramatized in the popular imagination by stories of stockbrokers jumping from windows, which are somewhat exaggerated, represent a specific response to financial loss that reflects the degree to which these men had identified themselves with their wealth. A man who has defined himself by his financial success and whose success has been catastrophically ended is a man who has, in a specific sense, lost not just his money but himself. The psychological crisis that results from this loss is real even when the material deprivation that follows is modest by the standards of actual poverty. The wealthy man who loses his fortune and has to live on a modest income is not starving. He is, however, a different person from the one he thought he was, and the adjustment required is genuinely difficult. The psychological experience of being wealthy during the Great Depression is a subject that the historical record documents imperfectly but suggestively. The wealthy of the Depression era are not psychologically uniform. They include people who experienced genuine guilt and responded with genuine commitment to change, people who experienced guilt and responded with denial, people who constructed ideological frameworks that prevented them from seeing their own position clearly, and people who are simply trying to maintain their lives in the face of a catastrophe they did not create and cannot individually fix. The guilt of the Depression-era wealthy is real but unevenly distributed and imperfectly expressed. It appears in the memoirs and letters of the period as a persistent low-frequency note, the awareness that the life one is living is in some proportion to the suffering of others, that the dinner being eaten in the formal dining room is connected in some way, however indirect, to the food not being eaten in the breadline. For some wealthy people, this awareness produces genuine action. The philanthropist who gives substantial amounts, the political activist who uses their position to advocate for policy change, the employer who maintains wages and employment at a cost to profits. For others, it produces the more common response of managed attention, an awareness that is real but that is kept at a distance from the center of daily life through the various mechanisms that social worlds provide for the management of uncomfortable knowledge. Cornelia's psychology during the Depression is the psychology of someone who is in the process of becoming someone different from the person her background intended. She is not, in 1929, a person with strong political convictions or a developed social conscience. She is a 23-year-old woman of privilege who has not yet been seriously challenged by anything. The Depression provides the challenge and her response to it, the reading, the collecting, the careful observation of the below-stairs world, the refusal to marry the kind of man her world produces, is the response of someone who is taking the challenge seriously without yet knowing what to do with it. By the end of the 1930s, she will have found something to do with it. The process of finding it is the story of her decade. Edward's psychology during the Depression is the psychology of a man who understands the situation analytically and manages it effectively and does not feel, in any very acute way, responsible for it. He did not cause the Depression, or if he contributed to the conditions that made it possible, he did so in ways so diffuse and so shared with thousands of other financial actors that individual responsibility is genuinely difficult to assign. He is a man of his world and his time, and his world and his time do not provide him with the tools to see what he is not looking for. He is not a bad man. He is a man whose goodness operates within the limits of what his world permits him to imagine, and those limits are narrower than he knows. Beatrice's psychology during the Depression is shaped by her specific position as someone who is neither fully within the world of the wealthy nor fully outside it. She has money and participates in the social world of the wealthy through parties and dinners and charity galas. But she also has the memory of not having money, and this memory keeps her from the comfortable assumption of entitlement that characterizes those who have never known anything else. She gives more to charity than is expected of her. She takes fewer of the perks that the studio's wealth makes available. She is not a saint. She lives well and she knows it, and she does not refuse to live well. But she is a person for whom the relationship between her own prosperity and the world's poverty is not invisible, and the effort of keeping that relationship in view is one of the defining features of her decade. The Depression does not end on a specific day. It ends gradually through the combination of New Deal programs that provide relief and some economic stimulus, the rearmament spending that begins in the late 1930s as the European situation deteriorates, and the full mobilization of the American economy for the Second World War that begins with Pearl Harbor in December 1941. By 1941, unemployment is still above 10%. By 1944, it is below 2%. The war accomplishes what the New Deal began: the full employment of the American labor force and the restoration of economic growth. What changes for the wealthy is both less and more than might be expected. The New Deal's financial regulations, Glass-Steagall, the Securities Exchange Act, the regulatory structure built around the banking and financial system in the 1930s, persist and constrain the financial sector's freedom of action. The tax rates that Roosevelt implements, reaching 94% on income over $200,000 at the peak of the wartime rates, are genuinely confiscatory by the standards of the 1920s, and they do redistribute income significantly. The labor protections of the New Deal, the National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, permanently alter the balance of power between capital and labor in ways that the wealthy find uncomfortable and contest throughout the subsequent decades. The social world of the wealthy changes more slowly than the economic and political world. The great houses continue. The seasonal migrations continue. The social calendar continues. But the cultural tone shifts. The conspicuous display of wealth that was acceptable in the 1920s is not quite acceptable in the 1930s and is even less acceptable in the wartime 1940s, when the moral weight of the national sacrifice presses against personal extravagance. The wealthy American of the 1940s is expected to demonstrate that they are contributing to the war effort, buying bonds, accepting rationing, supporting the draft, and the wealthy American who fails to make these demonstrations is subject to social criticism that the Depression-era wealthy could more easily deflect. Cornelia emerges from the 1930s as a person genuinely different from the person who entered them. She has become involved with the New Deal's arts programs, has spent time in Washington working on the federal art project's documentation efforts, has made connections with people whose backgrounds and perspectives are entirely unlike anything in her Pittsburgh world. She will not marry the kind of man her background intended. This much is clear by 1940, and she will not live in the way her background intended. The decade has given her the conviction that she needs to do something different. It has not yet given her the specific form that something will take. But she is 40 years old now, and she has more tools than she had at 23, and she is not afraid of the not knowing in the way she once was. Not knowing what comes next has become, over a decade of careful attention to the world, simply the condition of being a person who is paying attention. Edward emerges from the 1930s with his fortune intact and his position secure, though the financial world he operates in is now regulated in ways that require genuine adjustments. He is a good enough pragmatist to make these adjustments without excessive complaint. He is also, though he would not describe it this way, a somewhat different man from the one who watched the crash from his window in 1929. The experience of a decade in which the system he serves has failed so comprehensively has produced in him not a political conversion but a technical modification, a greater attention to systemic vulnerabilities, a somewhat greater willingness to accept regulation as the price of stability. He is not a new dealer. He is a man who has learned from the 1930s the minimum lesson that the 1930s require, and who has decided that the minimum lesson is enough, and who is not certain that he is right about this but who finds the uncertainty manageable. Beatrice emerges from the Depression into the wartime entertainment industry, which is the most prosperous period in Hollywood's history up to that point. She is doing well. She is also, as the decade ends, thinking about what the 1930s have been for America and for her, and she finds herself writing, not a screenplay, which is what she knows how to do professionally, but something more like a journal, the attempt to set down what she has seen and thought during a decade that asked more of everyone than the previous decade had. She does not know if what she is writing is any good. She suspects that whether it is good or not it is true, and that true is a more important category than good for the kind of thing she is trying to write. She will keep writing it. She will not stop. It is a winter evening in Pittsburgh in 1938. Cornelia is in the library of the family house, the 20-room house that her family has maintained through the Depression, that is still staffed, that still receives the right guests and serves the right meals and participates in the right occasions. She is reading a report from one of the New Deal art projects she has been supporting, a survey of unemployed artists in 3 Midwestern cities, and the specificity of the names and the situations in the report. This painter, this sculptor, this printmaker, this particular set of reduced circumstances, is making it difficult to read in the way that facts without faces are easy to read. She puts the report down and looks at the Ben Shahn painting on her wall, the one that shows a breadline in the rain, and she thinks about what it means that she has this painting in this house, and she does not come to a conclusion, and she picks up the report again. Edward is at his desk in his New York office reviewing the quarterly reports of the firm. It is late. It is always late when he is at his desk reviewing quarterly reports, and the reports are good. The firm has navigated the decade well. The regulations are a nuisance but manageable. The political situation in Europe is more concerning than the financial situation in America at this point. He makes a note about the European situation. He has been making notes about it for 2 years, and the notes are becoming more urgent. He turns off his desk lamp. The office is dark except for the lights of the city outside the window. He sits for a moment in the dark and thinks about the decade. He does not come to a conclusion either. He puts on his coat and goes home. Beatrice is on the terrace of a rented house in the Hollywood Hills, looking at the lights of Los Angeles spread out below her. She has just finished reading what she has been writing for the past several months, and she has decided, tentatively, that it is good enough to show to someone. She does not know what she will do with it if it is good enough. The decade is not over yet. The war has not started yet, though everyone who is paying attention knows it is coming. The lights of Los Angeles are very bright on a clear winter night, and the city is full of people, actors and directors and writers and refugees from Europe and migrants from the Midwest and workers in the defense plants beginning to appear on the edge of the city, who are all each in their own way trying to figure out what comes next. She sits on the terrace for a long time. The night is mild. The lights are very bright. She does not yet know what comes next either, which is, she has decided, acceptable. The decade has taught her at least that much. This has been Midnight Chronicle. Sleep well wherever in the world you are tonight.